All right, so we are resuming our study of the book of 2 Samuel. Obviously, 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally written as one book, but now, in our Bibles at least, it's separated into two books. The first primarily looking at the life of Saul, and then the second book primarily looking at the life of David. All right, so the last thing that we discussed, or the last thing that we covered in 2 Samuel chapter 4 was, and we are picking up with this idea about David's rival being removed. But we did have the question about what happens now with Saul's son Ishbosheth. Remember that he is basically had been replaced as the head of the house of Saul. Abner, in a lot of ways, has sort of taken over that position, but now Abner's been removed, as we've seen. And Ishbosheth, as a result, is a very powerless leader. And as a result, we noted that two men, Bana and Rechab, were two individuals that come in. And I don't believe we mentioned this, but in verse 6, they were actually able to get into the house by basically lying their way into the house. Verse 6, it says that they came there into the middle of the house as though they would have fetched wheat, and they smote him. And the idea is that they basically used this idea of going to gather the wheat from the field as a tool to get in the house, and as a result, they, through deception, could be able to take Ishbosheth's life. Now, this is important in the story, not just because of how Ishbosheth is removed, but also how does David respond to this? How does David respond to a rival, or at least in this case, the son of Saul? How is he going to respond to this death? Well, as we've seen from Saul's death, as we've seen from Abner's death, David's going to use this as an opportunity to show loyalty to the family of Saul, and at the same time show that he is a king that is concerned about all of Israel. So verse 8, it says that they brought the head of Ishbosheth unto David to Hebron, and said to the king, Behold, the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul thine enemy, which sought thy life. And the Lord hath avenged my lord the king this day of Saul and of his seed. Sometimes we may long for the past, remember the good old days and things like that. One thing that I'm glad that doesn't exist, or at least doesn't exist in our country today that existed then, was this practice of cutting somebody's head off and taking it to a person. That's just a very nasty thing to think about. But now the purpose of this is obviously to bring evidence, right? It's one thing to, they don't have cameras there, obviously, but the only way that you could prove that he died was you probably had to bring his head, because David spent time in the house of Saul. He would have known who Ishbosheth was. He would have known what he looked like. And so the two sons of Rimmon, Bana and Rechab, they do this as a way basically again to prove that they had actually gone and killed Saul. Killed Ishbosheth. There's no question about it. The evidence is right there before David. Now note how they approach David in this matter. All right, here's the head of Ishbosheth, but notice the words that they use. The son of Saul, thine enemy, which sought thy life, and the Lord hath avenged my lord the king. Now that's important because the sons of Rimmon here are trying to get David to remember basically all the negative things about Saul, right? Saul was your enemy. Saul was the one that pursued you, that drove you out, the one that sought your life, that drove you out of Israel. And you remember that because when Saul had died, we talked about how David had written a song of praise to both Saul and Jonathan, because that's how David wanted the house of Saul to be remembered. Not because he was David's enemy, but to remember all the positive things that Saul and Jonathan and the armies of Israel had done for the nation of Israel. And that's how David wanted it to be left, their memory to be left. All the positive things that they had done. But now the sons of Rimmon come and they try to disrupt that. And they note, of course, in verse 8, that this is God's doing, right? The Lord hath avenged my Lord, the king, this day of Saul and of his seed. So in other words, this is what God wanted. This is God's will. Just as your opponents have been removing from you, David, by the hand of God, this is another example of how God is working to help. Or this is another example of God's will being carried out. But David, of course, we know, had a very close connection with God. After all, he was a man after God's own heart. And David recognized that this was not the appropriate action to take at all. And just like that Amalekite servant back in 2 Samuel chapter 1 probably had a really surprising reaction to watching David being in disgust at the thought of Saul dying, these two sons probably had a similar reaction. Verse 9, David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, and said unto them, As the Lord liveth, who hath redeemed my soul out of all adversity? David brings up, you think about what you said. Is this really a case where God has redeemed my soul through your actions? And he does this now by, as we've seen this verse before, going back to chapter 1, the story, the account in chapter 1, where he says in verse 10, When one told me, saying, Behold, Saul is dead, thinking to have brought good tidings, I took hold of him and slew him in Ziklag, who thought that I would have given him a reward for his tidings. No doubt these two individuals probably looked at this in the same way that Amalekite servant did. This is an opportunity for us to get ahead in life. This is an opportunity for us to be respected under this new leadership of King David because we have taken out his enemy. Doesn't matter that he was a fellow Israelite. Doesn't matter that he was a fellow child of God under the old covenant. He's still David's enemy. And so in their mind, they think that they would receive a reward for what they have done. But David continues, verse 11, How much more when wicked men have slain a righteous person in his own house upon his bed? Shall I not therefore now require his blood of your hand and take you away from the earth? And so David acknowledges here what has happened. Again, as we saw, the two sons used deception to get their way into the house. They went and they killed him upon his own bed. And again, David acknowledges this as a form of murder because of what they'd done. Now, this is a very good point for us to think about. At least, and David was not perfect in this, as we see later on in the book of 2 Samuel. But David felt confident that his life could be an open book. David was very confident about his innocence in things. And that's because you think about in 1 Samuel 25, he didn't go and murder Nabal. He didn't take Nabal's life to avenge himself. David knew how to show restraint. David's life was an open book. At least at this point in his life, we've seen where he made the statement to Joab, right, who killed Abner, right, Joab, Abner's blood is on your hands. I'm innocent of this. I'm not guilty. And that's because David was a man that, as we have seen so far, was a man that lived life as an open book. He didn't mind people investigating what he had done because he knew he was innocent. But you think about the two sons of Baanah, right, that they had to use deception to go in. They took a man's life. They murdered a man just for the reward of what they had been given. And it's a good example for us to contrast these two sons from David because, if we're doing the right thing, we don't have a problem or we shouldn't have a problem with people coming and looking at us and examining our actions. You remember that Peter reminded Christians the same thing in 1 Peter 2, verse 12, to live honestly among the Gentiles. Even though you may be falsely accused, as he referenced in 1 Peter 2, verse 12, even though you might be falsely accused, if you live your life honestly to the best that you possibly can, you don't have to worry about the accusations that somebody makes, because they're going to be proven to be untrue if you live faithfully, if you live honestly. Which is always, it's not always an easy thing to do, but David was very confident in that. And so that gives David the right, verse 11 again, now to require his blood of your hand and to take you away from the earth. This being a form of a punishment required by the law of Moses. Men that committed murder obviously had to be put to death. So, verse 12, David commanded his young men, and they slew them, and cut off their hands and their feet, and hanged them up over the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the sepulchre of Abner in Hebron. And again, this is another very gruesome detail here. David not only kills the two young men, but you note here that they cut off their hands and their feet. Somebody made a good parallel here, potentially. You think about in the book of Proverbs, the 7 things that the Lord hates. A proud look, a lying tongue. 2 of those things, of course, were what? Hands that shed innocent blood. What about the feet? Feet that be swift, running to mischief. I don't know if that's why David took the actions that he did, but it does kind of make sense here, right? Obviously, with their hands, they took an innocent life. The idea of their feet being swift to mischief. You think about how they used deception to get into the house. Their purpose was obviously not for a righteous purpose, to kill Ishbosheth, and perhaps that's a very good parallel to make there. Maybe that explains why they lost their hands and their feet. Now you notice that David hung them up over the pool in Hebron. Now keep in mind that's a very, that is a sight that the public would have seen. This is not in a private, secluded area where this happened. But this is in a public place. Again, a pool was often used to either gather water, to bathe, things like that, to let animals drink or whatnot. But this was a very public thing that David does. He makes a public example out of these individuals. There was a story about a king in the 13th century that would, on the borders of his country, he would take enemy soldiers that were killed in battle, and he basically skewered them on poles and put them on the borders of his country, basically as a warning not to attack his country. And David perhaps uses this as a warning to the rest of the Israelites. And this ties in with something that we have, and it's a warning, right? Don't take innocent life. Don't think that you can get ahead in life. Don't think you can gain my favor by taking innocent life. Now, you think about why David does this, and it just reflects the point that sometimes people will do the right thing if they're motivated out of fear. And this is something that we were talking about on Wednesday night. And I think John there is talking about the mature Christian, that perfect love casts out fear. If a Christian has perfect love, he obeys God, not because he's afraid of hell, not because he's afraid of eternal punishment, because he genuinely loves God and he wants to be with Him in eternity. But there are other people that are not motivated out of love. They don't have that same drive. There are some people that we know that that they will stop doing things that are wrong only when they get caught or only when they get punished. And David perhaps reflects that thought by his actions here. think for a moment, turn in your Bibles with me to Romans chapter 13, because Paul demonstrates this exact point as well. Again, what David did there is is a sight we wouldn't want to see, but sometimes the king, in order to get a point across, had to make a point about what happens to those who do wrong. Now, we think about Romans 13, we think about the powers of the government. And you notice in verse 3 what Paul says about that. He says, "For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if you do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil." And the point very clear. The only reason you have to fear the law is if you break the law. Well, these two men had broken the law, and Paul recognized this, David recognized this, but laws were put in place to punish those who did wrong. There's some people that are just not motivated to do the right thing out of love. They're just motivated by the fear of getting caught. And so he sums up in verse 5, "Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake." And that's the idea that Paul gets at there, right? Be subject to the law of the land, in part because you know what happens if you don't. The wrath of the leader. The wrath of the minister of God. But he also says again, not only just for wrath, not only out of fear, but also for conscience sake. And that again is the idea that you do the right thing because that's what you want to do. You do it out of love. Well, David had to make an example of these two individuals because they obviously might have been the type of individuals, and there probably were some in Israel that would not do the right thing unless they did it out of fear. And we know that this can be true for us today. I know most of y'all in here, there are a lot of y'all in here that have grandkids, and obviously have had kids. You know that growing up, sometimes in order to get a child to do the right thing, sometimes a child had to be motivated to do the right thing because they were afraid of getting a spanking. And generally we mature out of that, we grow out of that. But we know that there are people in society that it seems like they'll keep doing wrong, they'll keep doing whatever they want until they get punished. And sometimes if the punishment's not severe enough, they're going to go right back to doing the same wrong thing over and over again. And so sometimes, I know there are some people that think that you need to sort of draw back on the punishment of criminals and things like that. But, I mean, really, there's a good reason why that people are punished for their crimes. There's a good reason why people are put in prison. There may be even occasions where the death penalty is okay, because there are some people in life that just need to be reminded that if they do something wrong, they can be punished for it. And unfortunately, that's the way that some people think. That shouldn't be said for us as Christians. We should be motivated to do the right thing because we love to do the right thing and not out of fear. With that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about thus far?
These two fellows who killed Ishbosheth, again, attributed this, they thought this was God's will. And of course, they were wrong. And you wonder how many wars have been fought through the years with one side thinking we're doing God's will, be it
right.
Crusades or Islam, and even today, we need to, if we want to make sure we know God's will before we say this, this is God's will. These two could have the smart thing to have done if they had the idea we're going to kill Ishbosheth. The smart thing to have done, in my mind, would have been at least to consult David first. Is
right.
A good thing to do. And if so, we'll go ahead with your approval, and that would have been one thing. But
right,
taking upon themselves and saying this is God's will, they were sorely wrong.
And they received their just punishment for it. Now, the end result of this is that, again, David is innocent of the matter, but now Ishbosheth has been removed. And basically now when we come to chapter 5, there's only one king that Israel respects, at least as their leader. In this chapter, or at least the first half of this chapter, we can sort of entitle this, David becomes king over all of Israel now, and not just over Judah. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 1. There is one thing I'll mention about 2 Samuel 4, verse 12. If you look at Deuteronomy 21, 22, and 23, it talks about that whenever a body was hung in a public display like this, it had to be taken down. I believe that let me double check before I tell you wrong. I believe it was the night. I had the verse written down, didn't have the specific. Yeah, he was not supposed to remain up that night. So if they hung up his body, it had to be taken down the next day, mainly for sanitary reasons. But again, that was just a form of punishment that David administered. All right, so 2 Samuel 5, verse 1, all the tribes of Israel, then came all the tribes of Israel to David unto Hebron, and spake, saying, Behold, we are thy bone and thy flesh. Now, their statement here reflects a point that David has made and recognized for a long time by his actions. Again, whenever Saul was killed, again when Abner was killed, and we've talked about this, but David always had Israel's best interest in mind. And he recognized that even though Saul and Abner and his enemies had died, some of those enemies were Israelites. They were fellow brethren. And that's what the men of Israel say. We are thy bone and thy flesh. Essentially, we are brothers. And they were through blood. They were also through because of the covenant that God had made with Moses. The old covenant. They were the children of God. So verse 2, also in time past when Saul was king over us, thou wast he that led us out and brought us in Israel. And the Lord said to thee, Thou shalt feed my people, Israel, and thou shalt be a captain over Israel. And so all the elders of Israel came to the king to Hebron, and King David made a league with them in Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Now, you notice in verse 2 the reasoning for why they put David, they want David as king at this point. And it is in part not just to his character, but also to his military experience, to his victories. Again, it was you that led us out and brought us in Israel. Well, that's a reference there again to the military exploits of David, which we have seen. And we have talked about how that helped build up his credibility within the house of Saul. The people remembered that. And the Lord said to thee, verse 2, Thou shalt feed my people Israel. Thou shalt be a captain over Israel. Again, when you think about this idea, the idea that they're bringing out here is the idea that David would not be a king that would rule with an iron fist, but would be a king that would, in a sense, be the shepherd of God's people. That's what their opinion was of David at this point. David was not a man who got ahead in life because he was power hungry, and the people recognized that. David wasn't responsible for those deaths that we've talked about before. They recognize that David is in a better position basically to be what Saul was intended to be. Not a brutal leader, not a totalitarian dictator type of leader, but simply to be the shepherd or the steward of God's people as king. And so as a result, verse 3, all of Israel comes to Hebron, which is where David and his men had been stationed, right? Because that's where he was crowned king back in chapter 2. They all come to Hebron, and as it says here, all the leaders of the tribes of Israel come and they make a league with David and his men in Hebron. They make an alliance, and they anointed David king over Israel. Now, this is a very good reminder this is a very good passage to remind us that sometimes the promises of God don't always get fulfilled when we want them to be. You remember that it was told Samuel back in 1 Samuel chapter 16 that David was going to be anointed. He was going to be the next king of Israel. It had already been set in stone because God had said that it would be so. And yet we think about all the adventures that David has been on since 1 Samuel 16. Again, being driven out of the land, having to serve time in the Philistine army, being on the run and having to worry about the fear of not just his life but his family's life, having to watch his wife taken away from him, just out of spite from the king. And even though all of those things happened to David, it still would not negate, it still would not draw back the promises of God. It would not keep that promise of God from happening. Sometimes in life we deal with adversity, whether that's physical, whether that's losing our job, whether that's economic issues, financial issues, whatever the case may be. There are a lot of things that can cause us to stop trusting in God's promises. And especially the promise of the fact that if we are faithful to God, God will provide for our necessities. That promise, sometimes we can lose sight of it because of all the bad things that happen in life. But I'm reminded, and I want us to look at one final passage before we draw to a close this morning, Romans chapter 2, where God through the writing of Paul, reminds the readers there about how sure the promises of God are. Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3, verse 3, "For what if some did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect?" You don't see the word promise there, but that's the idea of what Paul is getting at. There are some people that didn't believe what God said. There were people that tried to rebel against God because they didn't believe what God said. Did that mean that God's promises would not come to pass? Does that mean that the faith of God would be made of no effect because of what man thought? And Paul simply sums up, "God forbid. Yea, let God be true, but every man a liar, as it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy sayings, and mightest overcome when thou art judged." And Paul's point is that all those that rebelled against God, all those that tried to go against the surety of what God said, they were made out to be a liar. And you think about in David's life, how many times he had to deal with adversity, whether that was the servants of Saul back at the end of 1 Samuel that told Saul, if we get David out of Israel, David's going to become unfaithful, David's going to give up on God, David's going to turn to the gods of the Philistines, and then as a result, God will return his favor to you. There were people that made that accusation against David, even though God had already said he was going to be the next appointed king, even though we know that David was a man after God's own heart and would not do those things. That is an example of how the unbelief of men tries to halt the promises of God, the surety of those promises. And yet, we see in 2 Samuel 5, verse 3, after all the adversity David faced, the promise of God was fulfilled. He's now anointed as the king over all of Israel. And it's a reminder to us, looking at David's life, that when God makes a promise to us, whether that's with the necessities of life, whether it comes to the question about eternal life and what happens after this physical life, we know that those promises will surely come to pass. With that being said, is there anything that you'd like to add on to verse 3? What we've discussed thus far, verses 1 through 3.
I think it speaks well of all Israel that they swallow their pride.
Right.
And you wish people would do that today. I think in the political world, a lot of the problems we see are really based on pride. I'm with this party, that's the way it's going to be. Oh, well, no, I'm with this party, that's the way it's going to be. Well,
Right.
You know, forget about the party. Let's see what's good for the country, see where we can compromise and come together. But
Right.
it's just this steadfast determination to stay here or to stay here, and it's hard to really get things going with that bullheadedness, I guess, as we would say. So it's
Right.
well of them for, you know, humbling themselves and saying, David, you are our king.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, you think about how many times in a workplace, whenever a new boss is hired, over you know, if there's an open position for an employer or a new boss, you know, and you got one side of workers that believe in one way, or that favor one candidate, the other side of workers favor another candidate. Sometimes when your guy doesn't win, it's very hard to accept that new leadership. But like what Brother Wayne's saying there, that's a great point about the character of the Israelites because of their willingness to now accept David as their king, even though they may have supported Saul and his son. Now we'll just sum up verses 4 and 5, and then we'll draw to a close this morning. Now we're given a time stamp here about when all this happens. Verse 4, David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. And so, you know, if we were to go back and look at the records and saw that David was king 40 years, but he wasn't king over all of Israel for 40 years, we now know why, because of the events that happened between chapter 2 and chapter 5. And we'll draw to a close here this morning. Next week we'll pick up with David establishing a new capital for the nation of Israel. And that, of course, will be through the conquering of Jerusalem. Again, with that being said, we'll draw to a close this morning. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your attention.